Thank you, Roger. Thank you very much for that. I do not come in the traditions of Oliver Cromwell, I promise you. For me, the great heroes of the English Civil War were Lilburne and Winstanley, the diggers and those that led the radical section of the Parliamentary Army who mutinied against Cromwell because they were being forced marched to Ireland to take part in the genocide of the Irish people, and some of them were shot in Burford churchyard because of their stand for Irish freedom at that time. And so I come in the tradition of solidarity, not conquest. Is that all right? And I want to also say thank you very much for putting this conference on today. It's been absolutely fascinating for me being here all this morning, listening to the contributions that's been made, and I think this is a great location to have it in, but I'm slightly puzzled about this hotel. I know you've thanked them, but there's something out there called the Blair Bar. Yeah. Now, is this some kind of subliminal campaign to make him the President of the European Union, if you should be so unwise as to vote yes to the Lisbon Treaty? So you have it in your own hands, okay? And I also get the feeling that I obviously hope and believe that the Irish people will vote no in October, but don't scrap your posters, don't recycle them, because you're going to need them for a third referendum. Because I've just got a feeling they're going to keep on voting until they get the answer they want. I remember that day, just like Thomas, when the last Irish referendum result came through in the British Parliament, ministers started saying, we're going to have to look again at this. Hang on, what business of the British Parliament is it how the Irish people decide to vote? Yeah? But look at it again, they did, and then this rather odd protocol has been drawn up, and I'm very glad that Thomas has explained that so very, very well, because that is a dangerous thing. I'm here on behalf of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, which I'm Vice Chair of, but I'm also a founder member of the Stop the War Coalition, opposing particularly the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I just say that on the 24th of October, we're holding a very large demonstration in central London against the Afghanistan war. I think there's going to be parallel demonstrations in Glasgow or Edinburgh and other parts of the UK. But if you can do any kind of demonstration in Ireland on that day as an act of solidarity, that would be really, really welcome, because it helps to sort of spread the global word about it. 24th of October, I've already had an undertaking from friends in Mexico. They're going to demonstrate outside the British and the American embassies that day, so over to you, okay? Now, the points that I want to make, first of all, that I hope, understood Irish history correctly, in the sense that all the struggle for freedom and independence from the British Empire was not about Ireland joining in imperial adventures in the future. It was that expression in the great traditions of those that took part in the Easter Rising and others, that they wanted Ireland to be a different and better and correct force in the world. They didn't see themselves as joining European imperial adventures, and therefore the principle of Irish neutrality is absolutely central and very, very important. And I do not see how one can effectively marry the traditions of Irish neutrality with the signature for the Lisbon Treaty. And I think that's a message you've got to keep on and on putting over all the time, that the two things are mutually incompatible. Now, I'm pleased you're having a referendum. I wish we were having a referendum in Britain, because I stood in the 2005 general election, and the Labour manifesto, as indeed the manifestos of every other party in that election, every other party bar none, was that the new European constitution would be put to a referendum in Britain. The Lisbon Treaty comes along, and we're told that it's nothing like the constitution, it's totally different. Sorry. These days with computers, it's dead easy. You scroll down, you take a block, you put it in there, and you call it something else. You don't even have to rewrite it. You just rebadge it. And that's what has happened. This Lisbon Treaty is the European Constitution under a different name. And this fig leaf was used in order to avoid having a referendum in Britain. And I was one of those minority, unfortunately, of members of Parliament that voted to stick by what we said in the 2005 election, that there would be a referendum in Britain. I voted for the referendum. Unfortunately, we weren't successful in getting that through the British Parliament. And so you have to then think of how we campaign on this, and I'm particularly concerned about the military side of things. First of all, NATO has always wanted to have some much closer relationship with the European Union. That goes way back to the foundation of NATO itself. Now, NATO itself is a creation of the post-war Cold War. In 1948, it was a creation primarily of Britain and the United States, and it restricted for itself the North Atlantic area, and essentially it was geared up for a war with the Soviet bloc and the Warsaw Pact countries. NATO's influence has been malevolent, to say the least, on every economy of every country that's been part of it. It's increased vastly military expenditure. It's poured a vast amount of money into the hands of arms manufacturers and aircraft manufacturers, and developed for itself this huge power which was far greater than the influence of any one military in any one country, and it was also largely unaccountable. The idea of this NATO Parliamentary Assembly controlling what NATO does is a complete joke. They have no control over it whatsoever. It's a democratic veneer that's put over NATO. And so those huge levels of expenditure and the nuclearisation of Europe came through NATO membership. Now, in 1990, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Warsaw Pact was wound up. That was absolutely the point when NATO should have been closed down and wound up as well, and we could have gone down that road of European security and cooperation, which was all about cutting arms expenditure. It was about arms conversion, it was about a social Europe, and it was, in the words of Gorbachev, our common European home, all the hopes that were there at that time. And I remember in Parliament, the British Parliament at that time, there were some cuts made in military expenditure, not very much. There was some arms conversion done, not very much. But there was always this sort of influence of the arms manufacturers, the aircraft manufacturers, and the military strategists looking for a role for NATO. They were desperate to find some kind of role so that NATO could continue beyond the end of the Warsaw Pact. And in a sense, that was found more than anywhere else in the Yugoslav war. When the breakup of Yugoslavia and the war took place, NATO forces were moved in under NATO command. And after that, NATO then developed for itself this role as being the military arm of the European Union. And then, as the Afghanistan war developed some years later, NATO then gave for itself extraterritorial, out-of-area responsibilities and activities. So NATO is now a global military force with no democratic control, no accountability whatsoever, and under the terms of the Lisbon Treaty, Europe will become subservient to the wishes of NATO and the aims of NATO. We are creating for ourselves here one massive great Frankenstein, which will damage all of us in the long run. Now, the European Union, established again at the end of the Second World War, initially through the Congress for Cultural Freedom and then the European Coal and Steel Community, developed into the Treaty of Rome in 1957, has always had sort of three sides to it. One has been the social environmental bits of Europe which are generally acceptable and beneficial. The second has been a big debate about the economic model that Europe should follow, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment. And the third has been this great desire to create a European military and political force in the world, and that is where the Lisbon Treaty comes in. Now, there's two strategic points that have gone away from the social Europe model. There was the development of the Single European Act, which then became the Maastricht Treaty. The Maastricht Treaty did away with the social objectives of Europe, instead said the base of Europe has to be price control, has to be economic stability. Didn't say anything about eliminating poverty, didn't say anything about protecting the environment, didn't say anything about the social objectives of Europe. It was all about a market-based Europe. And then we move on to the next stage, which is the Constitution and the Lisbon Treaty, which gives for Europe the power to have an appointed or received president or God-appointed president, I'm not quite sure what. In the case of Tony Blair, I'm sure it'd be from the deity. That Europe would then have a political role in the world and would have a military role in the world, as Thomas and others have explained, absolutely, because the treaty links us up to the objectives of NATO and to the common defence. I was just asked this question by RT at lunchtime. How would this affect Ireland? I'll say this. I was in Parliament during the run-up to the Iraq War. I saw all the lies we were told. I saw these nonsense documents we were given. This attempt to bamboozle us into saying that Iraq was a threat to the self-defence of Britain and the rest of Europe. It'd be some weapons they'd have to get that far. And therefore, it was an act of self-defence to invade Iraq. That was the argument that was used. That was the argument that was used by the United States to invade Afghanistan in 2001. And that is exactly the same argument that will be used with the next war that is planned against some other country somewhere in the world, that somehow or other it is a threat to our self-determination, whatever it happens to be. And that is where this Lisbon Treaty takes us into. So I think one should be extremely cautious about that. The other point I want to make is about European foreign policy and where it goes beyond the boundaries of Europe. There can never be a targeted nuclear weapon. It is something that automatically kills everybody. And therefore, I think there can never be any case whatsoever for anyone holding nuclear weapons, be it Britain or any other country in the world. And CND holds that position very strongly indeed. Irish neutrality is something that's very important. And Irish opposition, therefore, as part of the New Agenda Coalition to the proliferation of nuclear weapons and support for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, will be damaged by support for the Lisbon Treaty, because the Lisbon Treaty drags us into NATO, drags us into the whole nuclear arms race and the nuclearisation of so-called defence policies around the world. And so what I hope is that not only will the people of Ireland be able to say no, but in saying no to the Lisbon Treaty, be saying no to the militarisation of Europe, be saying no to the extension of nuclear power around the world, and be saying yes to a social Europe and yes to a world based on peace and justice. And I'll conclude with this thought. What are the causes of war? Big question, but what are they? Are the causes of war not related to inequality, to injustice, to poverty and to greed? Is not the whole thrust of the direction in which the Lisbon Treaty takes Europe into one of a market economy, into powerful economic forces that exploit the rest of the world, into giving enormous, unaccountable, unelected power to NATO to decide what the military direction of Europe would be and drag the people of Europe in behind it, whether they want to be part of it or not? You're very lucky in Ireland. You've got a vote in October as to whether or not to endorse the European Treaty. Sadly, I think it's the only country in Europe where there's going to be a referendum on the future of it. If you succeed in getting a no vote here, that will be such a boost to people like us all over Europe that do not want to live in a European empire of the 21st century, but want to be part of a peaceful process in the world. What are the problems the people of Europe face at the present time? Job insecurity, social insecurity, concerns about money being available for health and all the other crucial issues of life. Those are the issues that ordinary people face. Does this Lisbon Treaty meet or solve or help in any way to resolve those concerns or difficulties? No. What it does is creates this military machine, this military Frankenstein, which will be so damaging to all of us. This conference today is an important way of bringing us all together. It's an important way of being able to get that message across, that there is an alternative. There is an alternative, a peaceful and socially just Europe playing a peaceful and socially just role in the world. If we go the other way,